Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ibrahim K. Sundiata. I am Emeritus Professor of History and African American Studies at Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts. I'm also a former fellow of the Du Bois Institute at Harvard University and former chair of the history department at Howard University and a former member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, I am a historian of Africa, so I was trained to study Africa, but the countries I chose to study are usually in war, chaos, etc., and it has not been a good place. They have not been good places to do research. Um, this is the 20th anniversary of a book that I'm very proud of, which I did not push. That is, I had one book party at my university, and then I had personal matters to deal with, and I did not, as we say in English, flog the book. The book sells itself. It's never been out of print. And the book is called Brothers and Strangers, and it is about the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which was founded in 1915 by a Jamaican immigrant to the United States, whose name was Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey had a tremendous movement from about 1919 to 1924. And I'll get to that in a minute because we'll be up at the 100th anniversary. Why haven't we heard about Marcus Garvey? He had more people, black people behind him than any other black leader. And what was he about? Well, the first thing was he came to the United States during World War One, and he came with a rather conservative program initially, and that was what was called industrial education. Black people should learn business. They should start their own business. Black people should build businesses for Black people in the United States. And the wealth that was generated should stay inside the community. This was later picked up by the Nation of Islam. This was later picked up by Louis Farrakhan. But the one who said it was Marcus Garvey. Then Marcus Garvey got the idea because it's 1919, and what's sweeping the world, there's an idea sweeping the world, it's called self-determination of peoples. It's a long phrase, right? Self-determination of peoples. The U.S. has said in World War One that all oppressed minorities, all people who were oppressed because they were minorities, because they had economic discrimination and cultural discrimination and cultural appropriation, those people should have independent states. And so after World War One, a number of states began popping up that had never existed. States that never existed. Seriously. Estonia. There's no historical Estonia. Latvia. My maps don't have Latvia. Yeah. And so there was Ireland, which had been a colony of the British for 800 years. The Irish should have a country, finally, after 800 years. That's a long time, right? And all over the world, people should begin to have self-determination. Now, what Garvey said is, if blacks and whites are in this horrible situation in the US, they will fight for the next 100 years, and blacks will whine. They will complain, they'll have marches, and they will complain, and they will have marches. And 100 years from now, they'll still be begging on their knees. And people saying, oh, isn't that horrible? Oh, look at that police brutality. He says, be a man, because he was very masculinist. We need a state. He said the U.S. is supporting Zionism. The U.S. says the Jews, who haven't had a state in 2,000 years, deserve Palestine. The U.S. says that. African Americans in the 1820s had helped to found Liberia. And he said there is this place with a lot of African Americans already. The U.S. government should encourage African Americans to go to Liberia, They should be given money, something like reparations, to have farms and industries. And not everyone can go to Liberia, but those people who want to go and get out of the hell that is the United States need to go. Complaint, complaint, complaint for 100 years, it becomes a show. It becomes movies. It becomes books, but it doesn't change anything. And they'll still be begging and crying 100 years from now. So what happened was many Black people joined, especially poor Black people who were desperate for a new answer. And when Garvey was speaking, it was during what we call the Great Migration. Many Black people in the South were moving to the North. They'd moved to the North in the war to work in the war industries. And then they wanted to stay in the North, where conditions were harsh, the weather wasn't good, and conditions were harsh, but they could get a job. But once they got there, they realized they were still discriminated against. And he said, wherever you go in the United States, even if you go to, and this was, let's say 1924, 1923, if you go to a beautiful place like Minnesota, which has less than 1% of Black people, you still can suffer. We later, almost 100 years later, we get George Floyd. Wherever the Black person goes in the United States, there will be persecution. The Black elite looked at him, at Garvey, as a foreigner. He had an accent. He was from Jamaica. He didn't speak African American English. He was phenotypically Black. That's important. He had a Black skin, not a brown skin, not a light brown skin. He hadn't been to graduate school. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a judge, but he inspired people. But groups of African Americans went to the American government. They met among themselves, and there was a movement, and the slogan was, "Garvey must go." People went to the FBI. There was already an FBI, and they said, he's un-American, he's a traitor. Garvey must go. And there was a huge feeling that Garvey was too crazy, he was too radical. He's talking about a clean break. He's talking about a divorce. And so eventually Garvey was sent to prison in a very strange way. He sent solicitations for money through the mail. And so he had sent a letter to someone sort of asking for money and then giving a piece of paper as a stock. And the federal government said, well, there's nothing to back up the stock. This is just a piece of paper. If this says $10, there's no $10 to back it up. Garvey bought ships, and those ships he had to pay extra price for, and the ships had trouble getting docking, and the ships were, there was all kind of funny business trying to wreck Garvey's business. Garvey was not about giving speeches on corners. He wasn't about magic. It wasn't there'd be a great wind and, Allah would come down and everyone would float up to a paradise. This was with tractors and cement and ships. Eventually, his people, with their nickels and dimes that they earned from washing floors and cleaning up garages, they got enough money to send a group to Liberia. And the group went to Liberia and said, please, brothers, because Liberia had a government. The president's name was King. Brothers, help us, please. We're being lynched. We're being hung from trees. We are in the midst of a terror. And the government of Liberia said, we hear you. We hear you. Now, the first thing you have to do is give us the money. So the Garveyite mission, there was a mission, like a diplomatic, they gave money to the Liberian government. And then the Liberian government told the US consulate and other people, they will never be allowed to settle here. They were put on boats and sent back to the United States, without money. And the movement collapsed. I remember once I had a very proper black secretary, and I mentioned Garvey, and she said, "Oh, that black clown from the Caribbean? He was made fun of. He was put in prison in Atlanta, in the Deep South. He was put in prison for 2 years. And then eventually there was a compromise. He was very popular. We had people saying they should go to the prison and pray. People should break him out. But eventually the U.S. government was very clever. They said, in our mercy, this is what we'll do. We will release you. We will let you out of prison. But you must never, ever talk black nationalism again. And because you are not an American citizen, you're not an African American, you're a Jamaican, you will never get a visa to come to the United States. So he was deported from Atlanta, put on a train, sent to New Orleans, which is a port, put on a ship back to Jamaica, and he never was permitted to come to the United States again. In the late 30s, he had a meeting in Toronto. That's in Canada. You can drive there. And he met people at the border. And white police were making sure that no one got across that border. Eventually, people forgot him. He wasn't well educated. He spoke very well, but he wasn't part of the elite, and his movement failed. His movement got smaller and smaller and smaller. And so eventually he said he took his movement. This is sad. He thought his movement would have more chance in the British Empire, that if he could convince the British to start decolonization. So he moved to London. His family was still in Jamaica. He had, I believe, 2 boys, one of whom I'm going to meet this year. He's a man of, his grandson actually, he was in his 80s. And so Garvey was penniless. He didn't have a job. He had a newspaper, but he couldn't sell it. And he would speak on the streets in the cold. And he would stand on the streets and say, a war is coming. A horrible war is coming. And first it will be the Jews. And then it will be us. Well, he got sick in 1940. He took to his bed. He was alone. And a week before he died, he was reading the newspaper. And he read his own obituary. He read his own death notice that he'd already died in poverty. Well, he died in 1940 in World War II, but not in a war, just a middle-aged man in his 50s in a room with a little stove, forgotten, made fun of, and having had the biggest black mass movement ever. I want to talk about that this year. Thank you so much. Now my editor has some questions for me. Speak, Pedro Henrique.
Thank you very much. I would like to know, if he was such an important figure, why most of us don't know about him?
Well, that's an interesting question. First, he lacked money. He got a lot of money at one point. He got quite a bit of money. He was very popular in the Caribbean, in the English-speaking Caribbean, so that he was much more popular among English-speaking Caribbeans, like Jamaicans, Trinidadians, Barbadians. So he had a base, but the base wasn't exactly African American. So he was able for a time to gather money, but then people said, well, what's going to happen to the money? Where are the ships? And so then he bought the ships, but then the ships weren't seaworthy. And so every time he would have a failure, his movement would get smaller. If you see what I mean? In other words, he says, I'm going to really get ships. I'm not just on a corner, yada, 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 yada. But as his movement was sabotaged, remember, the FBI, the white power structure said, this man is dangerous. He's dangerous. And so his meetings were sabotaged. There were spies. There were all kinds of people going to his meetings, writing down what he was saying, and then writing down things he wasn't saying, and he was anti-American. He said, I'm not anti-American. I just don't want to live with them. He also had a newspaper called the Negro World, and it was in English, French, and Spanish. Unfortunately, it wasn't in Portuguese. So he tried to break the language barrier. Like he knew there were lots of black people in Brazil, and he was always trying to get. He would have people who, let's say, knew Spanish, who could translate something into some kind of Portuguese, and he would have people who worked on ships, doing the dirty work, but who could read, and they would go to Natal or João Pessoa or Rio, and then read. And for a while, his paper was being read in Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, South Africa. He was very popular in South Africa. But then as time went on, the ships, he bought two ships, but they weren't seaworthy. And he asked the Liberian government, they just stole the money. And so then he made a big mistake. His chief antagonist, the man who looks like me, W.B. Du Bois, who was a college professor. Du Bois was very well connected to the white elite, and especially to the Republican Party at that moment. So Firestone Rubber Company was going to invest in Liberia, and they were going to invest a lot of money. And Du Bois got this idea that they might hire African Americans. This was real money. A real company was going to invest in Liberia to make rubber. And so Du Bois told him, man, I might have done the same thing. Look, this guy is just loud. He's got all these loud black people. All they do is talk. You are a company. You will invest, and I will support you in the newspapers if you say you're going to employ educated black men. Garvey made a big mistake. He had no source of white support, so he turned to the Anglo-Saxon leagues, and he turned to the Ku Klux Klan. That was death. Can you imagine? He was a black radical, and he says, you don't like us, we don't like you. You want to kill us, and we don't want to be near where you're killing us. We want to leave. So he appealed to some white racists who said, yeah, leave. We want you to leave. For many black people, this was a shock. You cannot talk to racists. But he did talk to racists. And that lost him a lot of support.
So the second question, I would like to know, why have you decided to write a book about Garvey?
It is because Garvey was diasporic. Garvey has a newspaper in South Africa and in Colombia and in Panama. He lived in Panama for a while, and Detroit and New York and London and Paris. And so he had this great diasporic idea, but he also should make us interrogate the idea of diaspora, because he was so inclusive that he lost a lot. In other words, he would say, up, I don't want to imitate him, right? Up, you mighty nation, do what you will, 400 million strong. Well, he meant every black person in the world was part of the nation, regardless of their religion, their language, their color, their country. It sounded great. Doesn't that sound great? But the point is, it wasn't true. There were people in Liberia who didn't speak English, who didn't want to speak English. There were people in South Africa. There were people in Brazil. And so he accepted a kind of definition that color was nation, right? When he says, up, you mighty nation, he means every black person at that moment in the world will rise up. It didn't happen. And that's why the book, what is the title of the book again? Brothers and Strangers. Because these were brothers in a sense, but they also were strangers. And not every black person in the world was going to come to him. Now, I'm going to tell you this. This upset some people. Garvey took the title of Provisional President of Africa. said, I'm president of Africa. That upset a lot of people, like who elected you? And you're from Jamaica. And Garvey never got to Africa. The U.S. State Department kept him out of Africa, and the U.S. State Department paid for Du Bois, his enemy, to go to Africa. So he was highly frustrated, and he also, if he were in Bahia, he would say, "You're all my brothers." He would say in English, translate that. You're my brothers. Okay.
The third question is, how is Garvey's movement holding up to this day?
Okay. Good question. I spoke to a relative about 3 days ago, and the relative said, "Well, I know his grandson, who's 88." And so what I said is, well, it's like going around and around. I mean, what happens is the movement got smaller, right? It got smaller, and it got more intense with the true believers. The true believers are left. So the old people, there are Garveyite organizations. There's more than one. There may be 5 or 6. And what I was saying to my relative, it was my cousin, I'm saying, secret. I said, look, the grandson. I would like to meet him. And also, I would like, since you live in California, I would like to go to UCLA where they have the Garvey papers. They're just sitting there, a whole room of Garvey. And so why not, since it's going to be the 100th anniversary of his betrayal, the betrayal of a great man and sending him to jail, why not have a conference and have all the groups come? There's some young Garveyites, but many are older, many are dying off, to answer the questions that you so wonderfully posed to me, the questions you posed, but other people might have other answers, right? And we could talk about this great man, flawed man, very flawed, who at one point in the 1990s got a lot of money. All kinds of organizations, white organizations, set up the library at UCLA. UCLA is University, of California, Los Angeles. It's a big place. Now there's this big room and all this wonderful stuff. But we don't just need a library with books. What we now need is a discussion. And could that have worked? And I have a question for you. Can I ask the editor a question?
Yes, you may.
Thank you, editor. Garvey would not be that popular today among some people. Garvey was strange. He had a very strong temper, and he was vaguely anti-Semitic. But at the same time, he was pro-Zionist. So he would say, you see, they're waiting and waiting and waiting. They should go and form a state in Palestine, as we should have a state in Africa. Why wait? Waiting is death. Today, we'd have to flesh that out, right? Because that doesn't sound very modern. You see what I'm saying? His whole thing is that if you don't have a state, he said no minority is secure without a state. Now that was his idea, that you may think you're secure, you may have a president and you may have a judge. And he was always talking about, even in those days, the presidents used to have they would invite a black judge to the White House, and have tea. They would never let them inside, but they would drink tea outside, right? And they would photograph it. And he says, they're so proud of that. But they're still being lynched. A woman might be lynched the next day. What is necessary is a secure place away from the United States and away from U.S. imperialism. He also believed that Puerto Rico should be independent, and he also believed that American companies should get out of Latin America. I mean, he was an anti-imperialist. You see why he had trouble. He is very radical. He's not just talking about integrating schools. If you see what I mean, it's beyond just integrating schools. It is fight imperialism, defeat imperialism, American imperialism. Well, that's it for today, folks. I hope that you will share these thoughts with friends and family and colleagues, as I have been doing and will be doing. often in my life, people said, well, what do you really think? So now it's right out here. Uh, this is a medium, and I'm going to be a little bit long about this, saying goodbye. It's a medium that I like in one way because it fixes something. I was on a meeting at the Association for the Study of African American Life and History um, just before COVID or during COVID. And there were some people who were very loud and they didn't like me, I guess. I didn't know them, but they got loud and they misgendered me, which was wonderful because it's recorded. I mean, they may deny it, but all of a sudden, but this is a way that information can be spread and shared, and also there can be a reaction to it. For instance, I plan to talk about Egypt, and I plan to talk about Black Cleopatra, something I've been writing about for years. And people said to me, "Why are you concerned about Black Cleopatra?" Well, when Netflix pays several $1 million to do Black Cleopatra, people notice. So I hope that you will share this discussion on Marcus Garvey and his movement, which is just the tip of the iceberg, and that I will see you again soon. Share this on Instagram, share this on Facebook, and let's stay in touch. I like you all, sincerely.